The auction block stood weathered and worn in the center of Millfield's dusty Main Street, its wooden planks scarred by countless desperate transactions. Sarah McKenna clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the gathered crowd, each word driving deeper the reality of her situation. Her father's debts had mounted beyond redemption, and now she found herself the final asset to be sold. Not as property, the law wouldn't allow that anymore, but as a bride to whoever could pay the price of her father's obligations. "Now we come to the matter of Miss Sarah McKenna," announced Jeremiah Wickham, the town's most prosperous merchant and unofficial auctioneer for such desperate circumstances. Her father's debts totaled $347 plus interest. Any man willing to settle these debts may claim her hand in marriage, with her consent, naturally. His cold smile suggested her consent was merely a legal formality. Sarah's hands trembled as she scanned the faces before her. Most were weathered men she'd seen around town, some kind enough, others she wouldn't trust to water her horse. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized how few options remained. At 19 she'd already turned down 2 suitors her father had suggested, hoping for something better than mere survival. Now survival was all she could pray for. $50, called out Morton Graves, a man twice her age with tobacco-stained teeth and a reputation for meanness to his livestock. Several women in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, knowing what such a match would mean. $75, countered Jake Morrison, younger but known for his drinking and the bruises his first wife had carried before she died in what he claimed was a riding accident. Sarah closed her eyes, whispering a prayer her mother had taught her before the fever took her 3 winters past. "Lord, if there be any mercy left for me in this world, send it now." $350. The voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and steady. Sarah's eyes snapped open as the gathered people turned to see who had spoken. A man stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair touched with early gray despite appearing to be no more than 35 years of age. She recognized him as Thomas Brennan, the Irish settler who'd claimed a homestead north of town 2 years prior. He was known as a man who kept to himself, worked his land well, and spoke little but fairly when he did business in town. $350, he repeated, his blue eyes finding hers across the crowd. Cash money. Wickham's eyebrows rose considerably. That's more than required to settle the debts, Mr. Brennan. Are you certain? I'm certain. Thomas stepped closer to the auction block, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. Miss McKenna, would you find such an arrangement acceptable? Sarah studied his weathered features, noting the calloused hands of a working man and the directness of his gaze. She'd seen him in church on Sundays, always sitting alone in the back pew, his hat held respectfully in those same work-worn hands. The stories she'd heard painted him as a man of few words but honest dealings. More importantly, she'd never heard whispers of cruelty or meanness about him. "I would find it acceptable, Mr. Brennan," she managed to say, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Then it's settled," Wickham declared, though his tone suggested disappointment at losing the entertainment of a longer bidding war. "The debts are paid, and Miss McKenna is free to marry Mr. Brennan at her choosing. Though I'd suggest sooner rather than later, for propriety's sake." As the crowd began to disperse, some grumbling about the quick resolution, Thomas approached the platform where Sarah still stood. He reached up to offer his hand, helping her down from the block with surprising gentleness. "I have a wagon just there," he said quietly, nodding toward a sturdy farm wagon hitched to 2 well-cared-for horses. "We can collect your belongings and head to the preacher if that suits you. Or we can wait until morning if you need time to consider." Sarah looked back at the small house where she'd lived with her father, knowing it would be sold within the week to cover what remained of his debts. Everything she owned could fit in a single trunk, and staying another night would only delay the inevitable. "I'm ready now, Mr. Brennan. But I should warn you, I don't know much about being a wife. My mother died when I was young, and I've spent most of my time caring for my father and trying to keep us fed. Thomas's expression softened slightly. I don't know much about being a husband either, Miss McKenna. I reckon we'll figure it out together. The ceremony at Preacher Williams' small church was brief and practical. Mrs. Williams served as witness alongside the church's groundskeeper, and within an hour Sarah found herself Mrs. Thomas Brennan, wearing her mother's simple gold band that Thomas had quietly asked the preacher to bless. The ring was too large, but Thomas promised they'd have it sized when next they came to town. The ride to Thomas's homestead took them through rolling hills dotted with spring wildflowers and new grass. The land was beautiful in the late afternoon light, but Sarah found herself growing nervous as they traveled further from town. What did she really know about this man she'd just married? He'd been kind and respectful so far, but they were heading toward his isolated homestead where she'd be completely dependent on his goodwill. "You're quiet," Thomas observed as they crested a hill that revealed his property spread out below them. "Having second thoughts?" Sarah considered lying, then decided honesty might serve her better. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of you exactly, but this is all happening so fast. This morning I woke up in my father's house, and now I'm married to a man I've barely spoken to, heading to a place I've never seen." Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop at the top of the hill, giving her time to take in the view. Below them lay a well-maintained homestead with a solid log house, a barn that looked recently built, and fields that had obviously been carefully tended. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided shade and wind protection. "I understand your fear," Thomas said quietly. "If it helps any, I want you to know that I won't. That is, we don't have to." He cleared his throat, his cheeks reddening slightly. "What I mean is, we can take time to get to know each other proper. I have a spare room you can use until you feel comfortable with other arrangements." Relief flooded through Sarah at his words. She'd been dreading the expectations that usually came with marriage, especially one arranged so hastily. "Thank you. That means more to me than you might know." As they descended toward the homestead, Thomas pointed out various features of the property. "The house is built solid, double-walled logs with good chinking. Stays warm in winter and cool in summer. The well is sweet and never runs dry, even in the worst drought years. I've got 20 head of cattle, a good milk cow, chickens, and 2 sows that'll farrow next month." The house was indeed well built, with glass windows, a luxury on the frontier, and a wide front porch. Inside, Sarah was surprised by how clean and organized everything was. The main room served as kitchen and sitting area, with a large stone fireplace and a good iron stove for cooking. 2 bedrooms opened off the main room, and a ladder led to a loft space above. "I know it ain't fancy," Thomas said, setting her trunk by the door of the smaller bedroom. "But it's sturdy and comfortable." "It's wonderful," Sarah said, and meant it. Compared to the cramped, deteriorating house she'd shared with her father, this felt like a palace. "You've built something fine here, Mr. Brennan." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "We're married now, for better or worse. Might as well use given names. Thomas then. And I'm Sarah." That first evening was awkward but not unpleasant. Thomas prepared a simple supper of salt pork, beans, and cornbread, apologizing for his limited cooking skills. Sarah offered to take over kitchen duties, grateful to have something useful to do with her nervous energy. "I should warn you," she said as she examined his stores of food, "I'm not much of a cook either. But I'm willing to learn, and I promise not to poison us both." Thomas actually smiled at that, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Well, that's more than I can promise. I've been living on burned biscuits and overcooked beans for 2 years now." As they ate, Thomas told her about the homestead, how he'd claimed the land, built the house and barn largely by himself, and slowly built up his livestock. He spoke of his plans to expand the cattle herd and maybe try his hand at growing some wheat for market. "What about you?" he asked. "What did you do before today?" Sarah found herself talking about caring for her father, about the small garden she'd maintained and the sewing she'd taken in to try to make ends meet. She spoke of her mother's death and how lost she'd felt afterward, trying to manage a household at 16. "Sounds like you've been taking care of others for a long time," Thomas observed. "Must be strange to think about someone taking care of you for a change." The comment was more insightful than Sarah had expected, and she found herself looking at her new husband with fresh interest. There was clearly more depth to him than his quiet demeanor suggested. That night, Sarah lay in the small but comfortable bedroom Thomas had given her, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside, the call of night birds, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods, the distant lowing of cattle. Through the thin wall, she could hear Thomas moving about in his own room, and she wondered what he was thinking about this strange day they'd both endured. The next few weeks fell into a pattern of cautious cooperation. Sarah took over the cooking and cleaning, finding satisfaction in caring for a home that wasn't falling apart around her. Thomas handled the outdoor work but made a point of including her in decisions about the household and even the farm operations. He asked her opinion on everything from where to plant a vegetable garden to what color to paint the kitchen walls. "You don't have to ask me about everything," Sarah told him one morning as they discussed whether to expand the chicken coop. "I know this marriage wasn't exactly traditional. You don't have to pretend I'm a real wife." Thomas looked up from the fence post he was mending, his expression serious. "You're a real wife, Sarah. Maybe we didn't come to it the usual way, but we're married all the same. Your opinions matter to me." Gradually, Sarah began to relax into her new life. Thomas was unfailingly kind and respectful, never pushing for more intimacy than she was ready to offer, but treating her as a true partner in the household. She found herself looking forward to their conversations over evening meals, when he'd tell her about his day's work and ask about hers. She learned that he'd come from Illinois, leaving behind family farm after a falling out with his father over his father's drinking and violence toward Thomas's mother. He'd worked his way west, taking odd jobs until he had enough money to claim his own land. The loneliness of homestead life had worn on him, which was part of why he'd made his surprising bid at the auction. "I told myself I was just helping someone in need," he admitted one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset. "But truth is, I was tired of eating my own cooking and talking to the livestock for company." Sarah laughed, surprising herself with how natural it felt. "Well, my cooking isn't much better than yours and I talk to the chickens all the time. So I'm not sure you got such a good bargain." "I think I got a very good bargain," Thomas said quietly, and something in his tone made Sarah's heart skip in an unfamiliar way. As spring progressed into early summer, Sarah found herself genuinely happy for the first time in years. The constant worry about money and her father's drinking was gone, replaced by the satisfying rhythm of homestead life. She planted a large vegetable garden, tended the chickens, and learned to milk the cow. Thomas taught her to ride one of his gentler horses, and she began accompanying him on trips to check the cattle. It was during one of these rides that Sarah realized her feelings for Thomas had shifted from gratitude to something deeper. They'd stopped by the creek to water the horses, and Thomas had helped her down from the saddle with his usual courtesy. But this time, when his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary at her waist, and she found herself not pulling away but moving closer instead. "Sarah," Thomas said softly, his hands still resting lightly on her waist, "I need you to know, what I feel for you isn't just gratitude or convenience anymore." Her heart hammered in her chest as she looked up into his blue eyes. "It isn't for me either." The kiss was tentative at first, then deeper as they both gave in to feelings that had been building for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I love you," Thomas whispered against her hair. "I know that might sound foolish given how we started, but it's true." "I love you too," Sarah whispered back, the words feeling both natural and miraculous. "I never thought I'd be able to say that to anyone." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Sarah didn't sleep in the smaller bedroom. Instead, she joined Thomas in the larger room, in the bed he'd built himself from oak timber. Their lovemaking was gentle and sweet, full of the tenderness that had been growing between them for months. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the moonlight streaming through the windows, Sarah felt a peace she'd never known before. She was loved and cherished, safe and secure in a way she'd never expected to be. "Thomas," she whispered into the darkness. "Are you awake?" He responded, his arms tightening around her. "I want to tell you something. About my father, about why his debts were so large." Thomas went very still beside her. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share." But Sarah found she wanted to tell him, wanted him to know all of her story now that they'd truly become husband and wife. So she told him about her father's gambling, about the men who'd come to the house demanding payment, about the fear she'd lived with for months before the auction. She told him about the shame she'd felt, being sold like property to pay another man's debts. Thomas listened without judgment, his hand stroking her hair as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I'm glad you told me," he finally said. "And I want you to know that none of that changes how I feel about you. You're not responsible for your father's choices, and you're not property to be bought and sold. You're my wife because you chose to be, and I'm grateful every day that you did." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, not tears of sadness, but of relief and gratitude for this good man who'd become her husband and was becoming her true love. As summer deepened, their relationship continued to grow stronger. They worked side by side during the day and spent their evenings talking, planning for their future together. Thomas spoke of expanding the farm, maybe buying the adjacent property if it came up for sale. Sarah dreamed of having children, of filling the house with the laughter and love she'd missed in her own childhood. The community began to accept their marriage as well. At first, there had been whispers about the unusual circumstances of their courtship, but as people saw them together at church and in town, the gossip died down. Sarah's obvious happiness and Thomas's clear devotion to her made it plain that theirs had become a true love match, regardless of how it had started. It was at the church social in mid-July that Sarah first felt like she truly belonged in Millfield again. Instead of the pitying looks she'd grown accustomed to when she'd accompanied her father to town events, she was greeted as Mrs. Brennan, Thomas's wife, a woman with her own place in the community. The other wives included her in their conversations about preserving the summer harvest and planning for the church's annual fall festival. "You look different," commented Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife, as they worked together to set up tables for the social. "Happier. Marriage seems to agree with you." "It does," Sarah replied, glancing across the churchyard to where Thomas was helping some of the other men set up a platform for dancing. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled, that warm, intimate smile he reserved just for her. "It really does." That evening, as they danced under the stars to the fiddle music, Sarah marveled at the turn her life had taken. Just 3 months ago she'd stood on an auction block, desperate and afraid. Now she was dancing with her husband, surrounded by neighbors who accepted her, living a life she'd never dared to dream possible. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked as they swayed together to a slower tune. "Just how different everything is now. How happy I am." Thomas spun her gently, then pulled her back into his arms. "We've got a good life, don't we? A good start anyway." "The best," Sarah agreed, going up on her toes to kiss him softly. "I love you, Thomas Brennan." "And I love you, Sarah Brennan." As the evening wound down and they drove home through the warm summer night, Sarah felt complete in a way she'd never experienced before. She had a husband who loved her, a home that was truly hers, and a future that looked bright with possibility. If she'd known what was coming, what secret from Thomas's past was about to shatter their newfound happiness, she might have held on to that moment more tightly. But for now, in the peaceful darkness of the wagon ride home, with Thomas's strong arm around her and the sound of their horses' hooves keeping steady rhythm on the dusty road, Sarah Brennan was simply, thoroughly happy. The trouble would come soon enough. For now there was only love and hope, and the sweet promise of tomorrow. The late July heat shimmered off the prairie grass as Sarah hung the washing on the line behind the house, humming a tune she'd learned at the church social. 3 months of marriage had settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Thomas rising before dawn to tend the livestock while she prepared breakfast, working together through the day's tasks, and spending their evenings planning for the future they were building together. "Sarah." Thomas called from the corral where he was breaking in a new horse. "Come see this." She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried over to find him grinning with pride as the young stallion responded to his gentle commands. "He's coming along fine," Thomas said, patting the horse's neck. "Should make a good riding horse for you once he's fully trained." "For me?" Sarah's eyes widened. She'd been riding Thomas's older mare, a gentle but aging horse who was better suited for farm work than pleasure riding. "Every rancher's wife should have her own mount," Thomas said, his arms sliding around her waist. "Besides, I thought you might like to ride with me when I check the north pasture. The wildflowers are something to see up there this time of year." Sarah leaned into his embrace, marveling again at how safe and cherished she felt in his arms. "I'd love that. Though I still can't believe this is my life now." "What do you mean?" "Just being happy. Having someone who cares about what I want, who wants to share things with me." She turned in his arms to face him. "My father never asked my opinion about anything. I was just someone to cook his meals and clean up after him." Thomas's expression darkened slightly at the mention of her father. Though Patrick McKenna had died just 2 weeks after their wedding, his liver finally giving out from years of heavy drinking, Thomas still carried anger about how the man had treated his daughter. "You're worth more than that," he said firmly. "You're worth everything good in this world, Sarah Brennan." Their kiss was interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. Thomas straightened, shading his eyes against the sun as he watched the vehicle make its way up their drive. Sarah felt his body tense beside her, and when she looked at his face, she saw an expression she'd never seen before: fear. "Thomas? What is it?" I need to go meet them." His voice was strained and he was already moving toward the house. "Sarah, I want you to go inside. Please. But. Please." The urgency in his voice made her comply, though she watched through the kitchen window as the wagon drew closer. 2 men climbed down from the wagon seat, one elderly with a sheriff's badge gleaming on his vest, the other younger with the hard look of a professional lawman. Thomas met them halfway between the house and the road, his posture rigid with tension. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation from inside, but she could see Thomas's shoulders slump as if under a great weight. The conversation went on for nearly 10 minutes, with the younger man doing most of the talking while Thomas listened, occasionally shaking his head or saying something brief in response. Finally, the men climbed back into their wagon and drove away. Thomas stood watching them go for a long moment before walking slowly back toward the house. When he entered the kitchen, his face was pale and drawn. "Thomas, what's wrong? Who were those men?" He sank into a chair at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair. "That was Sheriff Reynolds from Topeka, and a U.S. Marshal named Crawford." Sarah's heart began to race. What did they want? Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah began to fear he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They're looking for someone. A man who killed another man in a fight 3 years ago in Illinois. The man was wanted for questioning in connection with some robberies, and he skipped bail before his trial." Sarah felt cold despite the summer heat. "What does that have to do with us?" Thomas looked up at her then, and the pain in his eyes made her step back involuntarily. "The man they're looking for is Thomas Brennan." Sarah, that's not my real name." The words hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "What?" "My real name is Michael O'Sullivan. I took the name Thomas Brennan when I came west because I was running from what happened back in Illinois." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. The man she'd married, the man she'd fallen in love with, had been living a lie from the very beginning. "You killed someone?" she whispered. "It was self-defense, Thomas," Michael said quickly. "The man was drunk and violent. He came at me with a knife after I refused to let him into my sister's boarding house. He was known for bothering women when he'd been drinking. I only meant to stop him, but he fell and hit his head on the steps. But you ran. I ran because the man I killed was the nephew of Judge Morrison, one of the most powerful men in the county. Morrison made it clear that no jury would believe it was self-defense, not when his family's reputation was at stake. So I took what money I had and came west, hoping to start over. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. Everything she thought she knew about her husband, about their life together, was built on a foundation of lies. Is anything you told me true? About your family, about why you came west? Most of it. He stood up slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might send her running. I did have a falling out with my father, though it was about my wanting to leave Illinois rather than his drinking. My mother is alive, living with my sister in Springfield. The part about being lonely, about wanting a family, that was all true. But you married me under a false name. Our marriage certificate, the legal documents. I know. His voice was thick with misery. I know what this means, Sarah. If they arrest me, if they take me back to Illinois, even if I somehow managed to prove it was self-defense, our marriage wouldn't be legal. I married you as Thomas Brennan, but that man doesn't exist. Sarah sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The implications crashed over her in waves. If Thomas, Michael, was arrested and their marriage declared invalid, she would be right back where she started. Worse than where she started, because now she'd be known as a woman who'd been living in sin with a man she wasn't legally married to. How long have you known they were looking for you? She asked. I had no idea. I hoped the whole thing had been forgotten. It's been 3 years, Sarah. I thought I was safe here. So when you married me, you knew this could happen. You knew our marriage might not be real. Michael's face crumpled. I didn't think about it. I should have, but I didn't. When I saw you up on that auction block, looking so afraid and alone, all I could think about was getting you away from those other men. I told myself I was helping you, but the truth is I was helping myself too. I was tired of being alone. Sarah stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing space to think. I need some air. Sarah, please. Don't. She held up a hand to stop him. I need to think about this. She walked out to the front porch, her mind reeling. The man she'd fallen in love with was a stranger. Everything about their life together had been built on a lie. And now that lie threatened to destroy not just their marriage but her entire future. She thought about the gossip that would follow if the truth came out. The pitying looks, the whispered conversations about poor Sarah McKenna who'd been fooled by a wanted man. She'd go from being a respected wife to being a fallen woman, and in a small frontier town, that was a distinction that could ruin a person's entire life. But worse than the social consequences was the deeper betrayal. Michael had claimed to love her, had made her believe that she was cherished and valued. But how could any of that be real when their entire relationship was based on deception? She was still sitting on the porch steps when Michael appeared in the doorway behind her. Sarah? The marshal said they'd be back tomorrow. They want to take me to Topeka to hold me until someone can come from Illinois to identify me and arrange extradition. Sarah didn't turn around. And then what? I don't know. If I'm lucky, a jury might believe it was self-defense. If not. He trailed off, but they both knew what he wasn't saying. If not, he could hang for murder. Why didn't you tell me before? She asked quietly. We've been married 3 months. We've shared everything else. Why didn't you trust me with this? Because I was a coward. His voice was thick with self-recrimination. Because I was afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now. Because I was selfish and I wanted to hold on to the happiness I'd found with you for as long as I could. Sarah finally turned to face him. The way I'm looking at you now? Like you don't know me. Like I'm a stranger. She studied his face, the face she'd grown to love, the eyes that had looked at her with such tenderness, the hands that had held her so gently. Aren't you? I thought I was married to Thomas Brennan, an honest homesteader from Illinois. Now I find out I'm living with Michael O'Sullivan, a fugitive from justice. I'm the same man, Sarah. The name doesn't matter. The name matters, she said, standing up so quickly that he stepped back. The truth matters. How can you say the name doesn't matter when our entire marriage is based on a lie? They stared at each other across the porch, the distance between them feeling like miles instead of feet. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice barely audible. What do you want me to do? Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the summer heat. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. That night, they slept in separate beds for the first time since they'd become lovers. Sarah lay in the smaller bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to sort through her feelings. Part of her was furious at the deception, at the way he'd let her build her entire life around a fiction. But another part of her remembered the gentleness in his touch, the way he'd listened to her fears and dreams, the way he'd made her feel safe and loved for the first time in her life. She could hear him moving restlessly in the next room, and she knew he wasn't sleeping either. Several times she almost got up to go to him, but each time she stopped herself. She needed to think clearly, and that was impossible when she was in his arms. The next morning brought the sound of approaching horses while they were barely finished with breakfast. Michael had been quiet and drawn, picking at his food while Sarah tried to force down bites of biscuit that tasted like sawdust in her mouth. They're here, he said unnecessarily as the sound of multiple riders reached them. Sarah looked out the window to see not just the sheriff and marshal from the day before, but 2 additional men, a deputy and what looked like a local judge. This was clearly meant to be official and final. Sarah. Michael turned to her, his eyes desperate. Whatever happens next, I need you to know that everything I told you about my feelings was true. I love you more than my own life. That's the one thing in all of this that was never a lie. Before she could respond, there was a firm knock on the door. Michael straightened his shoulders and went to answer it. Michael O'Sullivan, the marshal said formally, you're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Morrison in Springfield, Illinois. You'll be transported to Topeka to await extradition. I understand, Michael said quietly. Sarah watched in horror as they shackled him like a common criminal. The sight of iron chains on the hands that had held her so tenderly made her stomach lurch. Ma'am, the local judge said to Sarah, I'm afraid there are some legal matters we need to discuss with you as well. What kind of legal matters? Well, if Mr. O'Sullivan here was using a false name when he married you, then your marriage certificate isn't valid. That means you're not legally his wife, and you have no claim to this property or his assets. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. What does that mean? It means this homestead will likely revert to territorial possession until the legal issues are sorted out. You'll need to make other arrangements for housing. Other arrangements? Sarah's voice came out as a croak. This is my home. I'm sorry, ma'am, but the law is the law. As they led Michael toward their wagon, he called back to her. Sarah. Go to Mrs. Patterson in town. Tell her what happened. She'll help you until I can sort this out. You won't be sorting anything out, the marshal said harshly. You'll be lucky if you don't hang. Sarah watched the wagon disappear down the road, taking with it the man she loved and leaving her more alone than she'd ever been in her life. The silence that followed was deafening. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, mechanically going through the motions of her daily tasks while her mind struggled to process the magnitude of what had happened. By evening, she'd made her decision. The next morning, she hitched up the wagon, thankful that Michael had taught her to handle the horses, and drove to town. But instead of going to Mrs. Patterson as Michael had suggested, she went straight to the sheriff's office. I want to see my husband, she told the deputy who was manning the desk. Ma'am, I'm not sure that's. He's my husband, she said firmly. Legal or not, he's my husband and I want to see him. The deputy looked uncertain but finally led her to the small jail cell where Michael was being held. He looked up when she entered, hope and despair warring in his expression. Sarah. You shouldn't be here. Where else would I be? She gripped the bars between them, needing some physical connection even if it was separated by iron. I've been thinking all night about what you said. About how you're the same man regardless of your name. Sarah. Let me finish. She took a deep breath. You lied to me about your name and your past. That was wrong and it hurt me more than I can say. But everything else, the way you treated me, the way you made me feel safe and loved, the way you've been building a life with me, none of that was a lie, was it? No, he said quietly. None of that was a lie. Then I need you to know something. Whatever your name is, whatever you did or didn't do in Illinois, I love you. I love the man who bid on me at that auction, who gave me his name and his protection, who taught me that I was worth something. And I'm not going to abandon you now. Michael's eyes filled with tears. Sarah, you don't understand. Even if I somehow avoid hanging, our marriage isn't legal. You could be ruined just by standing by me. Let me worry about my reputation. She reached through the bars to touch his face. The question is, what are we going to do about this? We. Because I'm not giving up on us without a fight. For the first time since the lawman had arrived, Michael smiled. What did you have in mind? First, we're going to get you a lawyer. A good one. Then we're going to prove that what happened in Illinois was self-defense. Sarah, I don't have money for a lawyer. Everything I have is tied up in the homestead, and now nothing. I may not be your legal wife, but I'm still your partner. And partners don't give up on each other. She spent the next week in a whirlwind of activity. She sold her mother's jewelry, the only thing of value she'd inherited, to hire a lawyer from Kansas City who specialized in criminal defense. She wrote letters to Michael's sister in Illinois, asking for character witnesses and anyone who might have seen the fight that led to Daniel Morrison's death. The lawyer, James Morrison, no relation to the judge in Illinois, he assured them, was an older man with a reputation for taking on difficult cases. After meeting with Michael and reviewing what documentation they could gather, he was cautiously optimistic. The key is going to be proving that your husband acted in self-defense, he told Sarah during one of their meetings. From what he's told me, there should have been witnesses to Morrison's threats and aggressive behavior. We need to find them. What about our marriage? Is there anything we can do about that? Morrison frowned. That's trickier. Technically, since he used a false name, the marriage isn't valid under territorial law. However, there are precedents for marriages being recognized if both parties entered into them in good faith and have been living as husband and wife. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. So there's a chance? There's a chance. But I'll be honest with you, Mrs. What should I call you? Brennan, Sarah said firmly. My name is Sarah Brennan, and it's going to stay that way. As they waited for Michael's extradition hearing, Sarah visited him every day, sometimes bringing food from the boarding house where she'd taken a room, sometimes just sitting and talking. The other townspeople's reactions to her loyalty were mixed. Some admired her devotion, while others whispered that she was a fool to stand by a wanted man. You know what people are saying, Mrs. Patterson told her one afternoon as Sarah helped with the laundry to pay for her room and board. They're saying you should count yourself lucky to be free of him and find yourself a proper husband. Let them say what they want, Sarah replied, scrubbing a shirt with more force than necessary. I know who my husband is and I know what's in his heart. That's all that matters to me. It was during one of her visits to the jail that Michael brought up the subject she'd been dreading. Sarah, I need you to promise me something. What? If this goes badly, if they convict me, I want you to move on with your life. Find someone who can give you the security and happiness you deserve. Sarah set down the basket of food she'd brought him and looked at him squarely. Michael O'Sullivan, if you think I'm going to promise to abandon you, you're out of your mind. Be practical, Sarah. You're young and beautiful. You could find another husband, have children, build a real life. I have a real life. With you. And I'm not giving up on it just because some things have gotten complicated. Complicated? Michael's voice rose. Sarah, I could hang for murder. That's not complicated, that's not going to happen. She gripped his hands through the bars. We're going to fight this and we're going to win. And then we're going to go home to our ranch and live the life we planned together. Michael stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head in amazement. How did I get so lucky? Lucky. Sarah laughed, though there were tears in her eyes. You call this situation lucky? I call finding you lucky. Everything else is just details we need to work out. As August gave way to September, their lawyer began to receive responses to his inquiries. Michael's sister had found 3 witnesses to the fight, all of whom were willing to testify that Daniel Morrison had been drunk and aggressive, threatening Michael with a knife. More importantly, they discovered that Morrison had been suspected of several assaults on women, though his uncle's influence had kept him from being prosecuted. "This is good news," Morrison told them during a meeting in the sheriff's office. "Very good news. If we can get these witnesses to Topeka for the hearing, I think we have a strong chance of getting the charges dismissed." Sarah felt a surge of hope, but tempered it with caution. Too much had gone wrong in her life for her to count on anything until it was official. The hearing was set for the last week of September. As they prepared to travel to Topeka, Sarah faced a difficult decision. The lawyer had warned her that her presence might hurt more than help. The prosecution could argue that Michael's desire to protect his common-law wife was evidence of his violent tendencies. "I don't care," she told Michael during her final visit before the hearing. "I want to be there." "Sarah, if Morrison is right and your being there could hurt the case, then we'll deal with that too. But I'm not letting you face this alone." Michael reached through the bars to cup her face in his hands. "I love you, Sarah Brennan. Whatever happens in Topeka, I need you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life." "Don't talk like this is goodbye," she said firmly. "This is just the next step in our life together." As they prepared to leave for Topeka the next morning, Sarah felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. Everything she'd built with Michael was hanging in the balance, but she wasn't the same frightened girl who'd stood on the auction block 4 months ago. She was a woman who'd found love and purpose, and she wasn't going to give either of them up without the fight of her life. The wagon carrying Michael in shackles pulled away from Millfield just after dawn, followed by the lawyer's carriage with Sarah inside. As they rode toward an uncertain future, Sarah whispered a prayer for strength and justice, and for the chance to build a real life with the man she loved, whatever his name might be. The territorial courthouse in Topeka stood like a monument to frontier justice, its brick facade weathered by Kansas winds but still imposing against the pale October sky. Sarah sat in the front row of the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she watched Michael being led into the courtroom in shackles. For months ago, she'd been a desperate woman on an auction block. Now she was fighting for her husband's life and their future together. Judge Hamilton was an elderly man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He'd earned a reputation for fairness but also for strict adherence to the letter of the law. As he called the hearing to order, Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is an extradition hearing for one Michael Patrick O'Sullivan, also known as Thomas Brennan," the judge announced. "The state of Illinois has requested his return to face charges of murder in the first degree. Mr. Morrison, you represent the accused." James Morrison stood, his confidence a stark contrast to Sarah's nervousness. "I do, Your Honor. And we intend to prove that not only should Mr. O'Sullivan not be extradited, but that the charges against him should be dismissed entirely." The prosecutor, a thin man named Hartwell who'd come from Illinois specifically for this case, scoffed audibly. "Your Honor, the defendant fled the scene of a crime and has been living under a false identity for 3 years. These are not the actions of an innocent man." "We'll let the evidence speak for itself," Judge Hamilton said dryly. "Mr. Hartwell, present your case." For the next hour, Sarah listened as Hartwell painted Michael as a dangerous fugitive who'd killed Daniel Morrison in cold blood and then fled to avoid justice. He presented the original witness statements, all from Morrison family members or associates, that described Michael as the aggressor in the fatal fight. Daniel Morrison was a respected member of the Springfield community, Hartwell declared. The defendant, by his own admission, struck him down and then fled like a coward rather than face the consequences of his actions. When it came time for the defense, Morrison called his first witness, Michael's sister, Catherine O'Sullivan Fletcher, who traveled all the way from Illinois to testify on her brother's behalf. She was a small woman with Michael's blue eyes, and her voice carried clearly through the courtroom as she described her brother's character. "Michael was never violent," she said firmly. "He worked hard, attended church regular, and took care of our mother after father died. The night Danny Morrison died, Michael was protecting me and the other women in my boarding house. Tell the court what happened that night, Mrs. Fletcher, Morrison prompted. Catherine's voice trembled slightly as she began her account. Danny Morrison had been drinking heavy that evening. He came to my boarding house demanding entry, saying he wanted to see one of my boarders, Miss Emily Walsh. But Emily had already told us she was afraid of him. He'd been bothering her for weeks, following her home from work, making unwelcome advances. Sarah watched the judge's face carefully, noting how his expression grew more attentive as Catherine continued. When I refused to let him in, Danny became violent. He broke one of my windows and tried to force his way inside. That's when Michael arrived. He'd been visiting for supper and was just leaving. He told Danny to go home and sleep it off, but Danny wouldn't listen. What happened next? Danny pulled a knife. A big one, the kind used for hunting. He lunged at Michael, screaming that no Irish trash was going to tell a Morrison what to do. Michael had no choice but to defend himself. Hartwell's cross-examination was aggressive, but Catherine held her ground. She insisted that Michael had only struck Morrison once in clear self-defense, and that Morrison's death had been a tragic accident when he'd fallen backward and struck his head on the stone steps. The next witness was even more compelling. Emily Walsh herself, the young woman Morrison had been pursuing. She was pale and nervous, but her testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case. Danny Morrison had been stalking me for months, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He'd wait outside the shop where I worked, follow me home, leave notes at my boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher had forbidden him from the premises because of his behavior toward me and the other women. Did you fear for your safety? Morrison asked gently. Yes, sir. Danny had laid hands on me before. Tried to force his attentions on me when I was walking home one evening. If a passerby hadn't intervened, I don't know what might have happened. Sarah felt sick listening to the testimony, understanding for the first time the full scope of what Michael had been protecting Catherine and Emily from that night. This wasn't just a barroom brawl gone wrong. This was a good man defending innocent women from a predator. The third witness was Patrick Mahoney, an Irish dock worker who'd witnessed the entire confrontation. His testimony corroborated everything Catherine and Emily had said, but added crucial details about Morrison's state of mind that night. Danny Morrison was drunk as a lord and mean as a rattlesnake, Mahoney testified in his thick brogue. He'd been bragging all evening about what he was going to do to that Walsh girl, talking about how no woman had the right to refuse a Morrison. When Michael tried to calm him down, Danny called him every filthy name you could imagine and came at him with that knife like he meant to gut him. In your opinion, did Mr. O'Sullivan have any choice but to defend himself? None at all. If he hadn't fought back, Danny Morrison would have killed him sure as I'm sitting here. Hartwell's cross-examination of Mahoney was particularly vicious, focusing on his friendship with Michael and his Irish heritage, clearly trying to paint both men as untrustworthy foreigners. But Mahoney's simple honesty shone through, and Sarah could see that the judge was growing increasingly unsympathetic to the prosecution's case. The most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Dr. William Crawford, the physician who'd examined Morrison's body after his death. Morrison had tracked him down and convinced him to make the journey to Topeka, and his medical testimony proved crucial. The deceased had extensive bruising and cuts on his hands and arms, Dr. Crawford testified. These injuries were consistent with wielding a knife in an aggressive manner. The fatal injury, a crack to the skull, was entirely consistent with an accidental fall. If Mr. O'Sullivan had intended to kill Mr. Morrison, there would have been evidence of repeated blows or more severe trauma. In your medical opinion, Dr. Crawford, was this death the result of intentional violence or an accident? Based on the physical evidence, this was clearly an accidental death resulting from Mr. Morrison's own aggressive actions. Mr. O'Sullivan's response was measured and defensive in nature. When it came time for Michael to testify on his own behalf, Sarah held her breath. Everything they'd built together hung on his ability to convince the judge of his innocence and good character. Michael stood tall as he was sworn in, his voice clear and steady as he recounted the events of that terrible night 3 years ago. He spoke of his fear for his sister and Emily Walsh, of his attempts to defuse the situation peacefully, and of the split-second decision he'd made when Morrison came at him with the knife. "I never meant for Danny Morrison to die," he said, his eyes finding Sarah's in the gallery. "I only meant to stop him from hurting innocent women. When he fell and didn't get up, I knew I should have stayed to face the consequences. But Judge Morrison made it clear that no jury in Springfield would believe an Irishman's word against his nephew's reputation. So I ran, and I've regretted that decision every day since." "Why did you come forward now?" Morrison asked. "You could have continued living under the name Thomas Brennan. What changed?" Michael's gaze never left Sarah's face. "I fell in love. I found a woman who deserved better than a man living a lie. She deserved a husband who could give her his real name, his real history, and a legal marriage that no one could question." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as Michael continued. "Sarah Brennan, and yes, Your Honor, I consider her to be Sarah Brennan regardless of what the law says. She's made me want to be the man I should have been 3 years ago. She's made me want to face the truth and clear my name, so I can offer her the honest life she deserves." Hartwell's cross-examination was brutal, focusing on Michael's flight from Illinois and his assumption of a false identity. But Michael answered every question honestly, never trying to excuse his actions while maintaining his innocence of murder. "You lived a lie for 3 years?" Hartwell accused. "You defrauded the territorial government when you filed your homestead claim. You committed bigamy when you married Mrs. McKenna under a false name. How can this court trust anything you say?" "I can't excuse those actions," Michael replied steadily. "I was a coward and I compounded my cowardice with deception. But I never murdered anyone, and I've tried to live an honest life in every other respect since coming to Kansas." When the testimony concluded, both lawyers made their closing arguments. Hartwell insisted that Michael's flight proved his guilt and that justice demanded his extradition to face trial in Illinois. Morrison countered with a passionate defense of his client's character and a detailed rebuttal of the prosecution's case. "Your Honor," Morrison concluded, "the evidence clearly shows that Michael O'Sullivan acted in self-defense against a violent attacker. The only crime he committed was the understandable but regrettable decision to flee from a justice system that had already declared him guilty before any trial could take place. He spent the last 3 years building an honest life, contributing to his community, and proving himself to be exactly the kind of citizen we want on the frontier. To send him back to Illinois now would be to perpetuate the very injustice he fled from 3 years ago." Judge Hamilton announced that he would render his decision the following morning, leaving Sarah and Michael to spend another sleepless night wondering about their future. The lawyer had arranged for them to have a brief meeting in the courthouse's holding cell, their first moment alone since his arrest. "How are you holding up?" Michael asked, reaching through the bars to take her hands. "I should be asking you that question," Sarah replied, fighting back tears. "Michael, your testimony today, when you said you wanted to clear your name for me? I meant every word. Sarah, whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that you've made me a better man. These past months with you have been worth whatever price I have to pay now. Don't talk like that. We're going to win this. We have to. And if we don't?" Sarah gripped his hands tighter. "Then we'll figure out what comes next. Together. I'm not giving up on us, Michael O'Sullivan. I don't care what name you go by or what legal papers say, you're my husband and I'm your wife, and that's not going to change." The next morning, the courthouse was packed with spectators, word having spread throughout Topeka about the dramatic case. Sarah sat in her usual spot in the front row, flanked by Catherine Fletcher and Emily Walsh, who'd become unlikely allies in the fight for Michael's freedom. Judge Hamilton entered precisely at 9 o'clock, his expression giving nothing away as he took his seat. The bailiff called for order and the judge began to speak. "This court has heard compelling testimony from both sides regarding the events of September 15, 1881, in Springfield, Illinois. The question before this court is not whether Michael O'Sullivan killed Daniel Morrison. That fact is not in dispute. The question is whether that killing constituted murder or justifiable self-defense. Sarah's heart hammered as the judge continued his analysis of the evidence. The testimony of Mrs. Fletcher, Miss Walsh, Mr. Mahoney, and Dr. Crawford has painted a clear picture of the events of that night. Daniel Morrison was intoxicated, violent, and armed with a deadly weapon. He was attempting to force entry into a private residence for the purpose of assaulting a young woman who had repeatedly rebuffed his advances. Mr. O'Sullivan's actions in defending his sister, Miss Walsh, and himself were not only justified but commendable. Sarah felt a surge of hope, but the judge wasn't finished. However, this court cannot ignore Mr. O'Sullivan's flight from Illinois and his subsequent assumption of a false identity. These actions, while understandable given the circumstances he faced, were still violations of the law. Sarah's heart sank, but Judge Hamilton continued. That said, this court finds that the original charges of murder were without merit and that extradition to Illinois would serve no purpose of justice. The charges against Michael O'Sullivan are hereby dismissed. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah leaped to her feet, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched Michael's shoulders sag with relief. But the judge wasn't finished. However, he said, his voice cutting through the celebration, there remains the matter of Mr. O'Sullivan's violation of territorial law regarding fraudulent identity and the legal status of his marriage to Mrs. McKenna. Sarah's celebration died in her throat. Even if Michael was free, their marriage could still be declared invalid. Given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, and taking into account the testimony regarding Mr. O'Sullivan's character and his contributions to his community, this court is prepared to offer the following resolution. Mr. O'Sullivan will pay a fine of $50 for the violation of territorial law regarding false identity. In return, this court will recognize his marriage to Sarah McKenna as valid, provided they undergo a second ceremony using his legal name within 30 days. Sarah couldn't contain herself any longer. She rushed toward the defendant's table as the bailiff removed Michael's shackles, throwing herself into his arms the moment he was free. "It's over," she sobbed against his chest. "It's really over." "Not quite," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "We still need to get married again. Properly this time." "I can't wait," Sarah laughed through her tears. "Though I should probably get used to being called Mrs. O'Sullivan instead of Mrs. Brennan." "Actually," Michael said, pulling back to look at her, "I was thinking we might keep the name Brennan. Thomas Brennan died the day I walked into that courtroom and told the truth. Maybe it's time for Michael O'Sullivan to become the man Thomas Brennan was supposed to be." The journey back to Millfield took 3 days, but it felt like a triumphant procession. Word of their victory had somehow reached the town ahead of them, and they were met at the edge of their property by a crowd of neighbors who'd come to welcome them home. "We never doubted you for a minute," declared Mrs. Patterson, though Sarah suspected that wasn't entirely true. "The whole town's been praying for your safe return." Their homestead had been maintained by their neighbors during their absence. The livestock fed, the house cleaned, even the late garden vegetables harvested and preserved. It was a testament to the community they'd built, the life they'd earned through hard work and honest dealing. The second wedding ceremony took place the following Sunday at the Millfield Church, with half the town in attendance. This time, Sarah walked down the aisle as a free woman choosing her husband, not as a desperate bride being sold to pay debts. This time, Michael stood at the altar as himself, offering his real name and his true heart. "Do you, Michael Patrick O'Sullivan, take Sarah Elizabeth McKenna to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Preacher Williams asked. "I do," Michael said, his voice ringing clear and strong through the church. "And do you, Sarah Elizabeth McKenna, take Michael Patrick O'Sullivan to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Sarah looked into her husband's eyes, no longer shadowed by secrets but bright with hope and love. "I do." As they kissed to seal their union, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the auction block to the courthouse in Topeka, they'd faced every challenge together and emerged stronger for it. The reception afterward was held in their own front yard, with tables groaning under the weight of food brought by their neighbors. Children ran between the adults, playing games in the gathering dusk, while the men discussed plans for the fall harvest and the women shared recipes and gossip. "You know," Catherine Fletcher said to Sarah as they watched Michael laughing with some of the other men, "I wasn't sure about you when I first heard Michael had married someone he'd barely known. But seeing you two together, seeing how you fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself, you're exactly what he needed." "He saved me first," Sarah replied. "That day at the auction he didn't just pay my father's debts. He gave me a life worth living." As the evening wound down and their guests began to depart, Sarah and Michael found themselves alone on their front porch, watching the last of the wagons disappear down the road. "So," Michael said, wrapping his arms around her from behind, "how does it feel to be Mrs. O'Sullivan?" "It feels perfect," Sarah said, leaning back against his chest. "Though I have to admit, I'm going to miss being Mrs. Brennan." "We can be whoever we want to be," Michael murmured against her hair. "The important thing is that we're together, legally and forever." Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "No more secrets? No more lies. No more secrets. No more lies. Just you and me and whatever life brings us next." As they stood together under the star-filled Kansas sky, Sarah marveled at the turns her life had taken. A year ago she'd been a desperate woman with no future. Now she was a wife, a partner, a woman who'd fought for love and won. Winter was coming, she could feel it in the crisp edge to the night air. But this winter would be different from all the others. This winter she wouldn't be alone or afraid. She'd be safe in the arms of a man who loved her enough to risk everything for the truth, warm in a house they'd built together, secure in a community that had rallied around them when they needed it most. "Michael," she said softly. "Oh, I love you. Not Thomas Brennan, not some fantasy I created in my head. Michael O'Sullivan. The real you." He kissed her then, slow and sweet under the vast frontier sky. "And I love you, Sarah O'Sullivan. My wife, my partner, my salvation." They went inside together, to the house they'd nearly lost, to the bed they'd shared as both strangers and soulmates, to the life they'd fought to build and won the right to keep. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods by the creek, and in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. But inside their home, there was only warmth and love and the sweet promise of tomorrow. The auction block seemed like a lifetime ago now. The desperate girl who'd stood there, willing to marry anyone who could pay her father's debts, was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned that love wasn't something to be bought or sold, but something to be earned and cherished and fought for with everything you had. As Sarah drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the strange path that had brought them together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the daily work of running a homestead, the seasonal struggles of frontier life, perhaps someday the joy of children to fill their home with laughter. But whatever came, they would face it together, with honest hearts and unshakable love. The arranged marriage had become true love, tested by fire and proven genuine. The secret that had nearly destroyed them had instead made them stronger, forcing them to choose each other not out of desperation or convenience, but out of deep and abiding love. And in the morning Sarah O'Sullivan would wake up next to her husband, her real, legal, honest-to-goodness husband, and begin another day of the life they'd built together, one truth at a time.